Thank you, Kalani. I am here to introduce John Walsh, who is the Chief Scientist of the International Research Center and the President's Professor of Global Change at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He is also the co-director of the Alaska Center for the Climate Assessment and Policy. His research has addressed Arctic climate and weather variability, both as observed historically and predicted for the future. Walsh has also he's the lead author for the 2014 U.S. National Climate Assessment and for the fourth assessment report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He currently chairs the Climate Expert Group of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. Prior to moving to Alaska in 2003, Mr. Walsh spent 30 years on the faculty for the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Illinois. He has co-authored a textbook, Severe and Hazardous Weather. He received his BS in mathematics from Dartmouth College and a PhD in meteorology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Welcome, Mr. Walsh.
Thanks very much, Jackie. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's an honor to be speaking at this conference. And I'll try to link climate change in the Alaska region to the health topic that's the focus of this conference. This opening slide just shows the scale of some of the climate impacts that we'll try to place into context. These are two satellite images, one showing an algal bloom in the Bering Sea, that's on the left. And the slide on the right shows a smoke shroud over interior Alaska during a wildfire season. Both of those have health implications. So here's how we'll try to cover the subject. I'll start out with some highlights of recent climate change in Alaska, and then jump directly into some potential health-related concerns of these changes. And we'll focus in on the increase of temperatures in both the air and the water. Then we'll look at the longer, drier summers, some of those potential health impacts. And finally, we'll survey some hazards, increases in hazards that are associated with climate change. All of these do have health implications. So let's start out with the big picture. This is a map of the pattern of warming that has occurred over the past 50 years in the Northern Hemisphere. We're looking down from the North Pole. And what stands out here is that the Arctic has warmed more than any other part of the world. Alaska is in the high warming zone. If you look at the color scale there, the warming in Alaska is between 2 and 4 degrees C. That converts to 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a noticeable warming. And this warming that we've experienced is typical of this overall pattern. They call that Arctic amplification. The Arctic has warmed more than the rest of the world, and that's one of the characteristics of climate change. If we zero in on Alaska, which is our region of interest, here's a breakdown of how the warming has varied seasonally. We go from winter on the upper left, spring on the upper right, summer on the lower left, and autumn on the lower right. The message here is that the greatest warming has occurred in winter. Warming is more than 5 degrees C in the last decade in many parts of Alaska in winter. Autumn has warmed quite a bit, especially in the west and the north, largely because sea ice has been lost. What's interesting here is that summer actually has had very little warming, even a very slight cooling in the eastern half of the state. So there is a seasonal character to this warming that we're going to deal with when it comes to the health impacts. So let's go right to the health-related concerns, starting with those warmer temperatures. And what we'll focus in on here are the effects of warmer temperatures on invasive species. These include insects, vegetation, and even wildlife. Here's an example of an invasive species, an insect. It's the spruce bark beetle. The bark beetle has made its presence known in western Alaska and the Kenai Peninsula since the 1990s. But the most recent outbreak that seems to be associated with the warming temperatures has occurred in south central Alaska. The upper photo there is an actual beetle photo. Lower left is a tree that's infected by the beetles. And that middle photo on the bottom shows a view of a sort of a landscape view. That hillside that's shaded purplish brown is infested by the bark beetles. And on the right, we show how the acreage damaged by these bark beetles has increased dramatically since 2015. Just in the last year or two, this bark beetle outbreak has reached Denali Park. So it's actually expanding northwards. So it definitely has an impact on the forest environment that many of us experience. Another health impact has to do with the West Nile virus. The virus hasn't been detected yet in Alaska, but this map shows where it has been detected. And the concern is that with the warming, the virus may find its way to Alaska in the next several years to a decade. The way that's most likely to happen is through migratory birds. The mosquitoes themselves that carry the West Nile virus cannot survive in a climate like Alaska's, but for short periods of time, they can pick up the virus from these migratory birds and transmit that virus to other living things, including humans and livestock and that type of thing. So the concern is that the warming temperatures may well tip the scales to the point where West Nile virus is something we have to deal with, even in a region as far north as Alaska. Wildlife impacts are illustrated here in these graphics. The panels on the left show walrus. That's one marine mammal species that's been impacted by the warming climate through the loss of sea ice. Walrus preferred habitat is a sea ice platform where they can dive for food in shallow water. With the loss of sea ice due to the warming temperatures of the last decade or two, the summer sea ice has essentially disappeared from the shallow water regions of our coastal areas. That lower left panel shows a walrus haulout. There are literally hundreds of walrus at the base of that cliff that have hauled out from the water because the sea ice platform that they would normally use is no longer present. So walrus is a marine mammal that's been impacted. On the right, we show the expansion of beaver habitat on land. This has been documented by Ken Tate and several others here at the University of Alaska. The migration that's been most apparent has been in northwest Alaska, north of the Seward Peninsula and the Kotzebue region. The beavers are actually migrating into northwestern Alaska, altering the landscape, and that has implications for water usage as well. One final impact of the warming temperatures has to do with the perspectives of indigenous communities. This is a calendar circle that's been put together by several researchers in collaboration with native groups, showing how the annual cycle, the seasonal cycle, which goes from winter on the top to spring on the right, summer on the bottom, and autumn on the left, how that has changed for various activities such as moose hunting, driftwood gathering, and fishing. There are two lines in that diagram. The present day is the solid line, the past is the dotted line. And for activities like moose hunting and ice fishing, you can see how the time window has changed. Things are starting later in the year for that type of activity. And for many activities, the winter activities are ending earlier in the spring. So this is an interesting and a very nice way of summarizing the impacts on the ground of the warming climate and how it's impacting the use of the land by communities throughout Alaska. One benefit of the warming climate is that there are fewer days of extreme cold. This photo is of a bank thermometer, a fairly accurate bank thermometer in Fairbanks, about a mile from the UAF campus during a cold outbreak maybe 7 or 8 years ago. We're seeing far fewer of those outbreaks than we used to. The top graphic shows the history of days when it reached minus 40 degrees in Fairbanks, the number of days per year when Fairbanks reached minus 40. There's been a downward trend in those days. And the bottom graphic shows the projection or the prediction for the future, the prediction of the number of days each year when the daily average is minus 20 or colder. And those days, the number of days per year drops off fairly dramatically. And some years that we don't get any of those really cold days in the future. So that could be looked at as one benefit of the warming. Let's turn to the water temperatures. Those examples we looked at just a minute ago were on for land. Algal blooms are one of the main concerns of the warming waters. This graphic shows the water temperatures around Alaska during several recent winters rather. And the color scale there has the dark reds indicating warmer than past conditions by 3 to 5 degrees C. That's maybe 6 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. This actually is a summer depiction because there would be ice at the surface in the winter. But the main point here is that this unusually warm water has been appearing in all the seas surrounding Alaska, especially near the coast. And the warming is large enough to be felt, as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That has implications for these algal blooms that can survive in the higher temperatures. In fact, they require higher temperatures for part of their life cycle. And the bloom here is in the Bering Sea. These algal blooms can contain toxins. And what we're seeing are increasing detections of toxins in marine mammals and seabirds. This graphic shows it maps out the detections of toxins, harmful toxins in various types of marine mammals. The whales are the larger orange symbols. Sea otters are the purple ones. Seabirds are the blue bird symbols. And you can see how the numbers of detections in recent years is fairly large, all the way from the southeast up to the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea. So we are seeing the impacts of these toxins, which can affect marine mammals and ultimately humans if affected shellfish are actually consumed. So this is one of the impacts of a warming climate through the warming water temperatures. We've also seen warmer water temperatures in inland areas. That was an unusually warm Yukon River water temperature sequence back in 2019, 2 years ago, and that was associated with a die-off of migrating salmon in western Alaska. So there's some major implications here for the salmon harvest and for subsistence foods that supply many of the interior communities. And for the expectation is that these rising water temperatures in the rivers will continue into the future as the climate warms. Now let's look briefly at the longer, drier summers, and in particular the impacts of more evapotranspiration. These impacts of the warmer summers include fire risk, and they extend into the air quality domain. One thing we're seeing already is an increase in the growing season length. This is the number of days when the air temperature stays above freezing. That trend is expected to continue. This graphic shows the growing season length for the last few decades and how it's projected to change in various parts of Alaska. And in all regions, the expectation is the growing length is going to increase by 1 to 2 months by the end of the century. The increase is several weeks already. So we're well on our way to that 1 to 2 month increase. The bottom line there is longer summers, longer warm periods. As I mentioned earlier, that has implications for evaporation and for drying. Here's a map of the increase in flammability of the fuels for wildfires. The fuels for the wildfires include the grasses and the trees, the vegetation. This figure was put together by Uma Bhatt here at the University of Alaska. The map shows the trend in flammability of the vegetation in June. You can see how much of Alaska is in the brown, which means the flammability is increased, especially in the Yukon Flats area. That area stands out more than any. Even over in much of Asia, Russia, the trend is towards increased flammability. There are very few areas on that map that are in blue, which would indicate decreasing flammability. That effect is already showing up in the wildfire activity. This graphic shows the number of days with visibility reduced by smoke in Fairbanks, going back to the early 1950s. You can see how the last 2 decades have far more days with smoke-reduced visibility, days with smoke in the air, and that would have detectable impacts on what we breathe. That increase started back in the early 2000s and has become especially apparent in the last 2 decades. Here's an example of what that means for air quality. There's a pair of photos of downtown Fairbanks. One is the nice summer day image that we'd like to show tourists. The bottom photo is that same scene during a wildfire episode back in 2004. Visibility is down under a half mile. And that's obviously hazardous air quality. So the health impacts are direct in a case like this. But that's an example of what we're seeing the increasing frequency of. And a somewhat related impact, although a different source, of the drying summers, of the longer summers, is road dust. This is the problem more in the rural areas where the roads are not paved. But road dust can be a health hazard. As summers lengthen, there are going to be more dry periods when the roads are essentially susceptible to the dust from any vehicle that passes by. The vehicles can range from 16-wheelers down to the 4-wheel vehicles. So the impacts here are more than just wildfire. We need to be concerned about air quality from local sources, and many interior communities are well aware of this health hazard in the summer. I'll finish with a brief survey of the increase in hazards, some of the hazards that are associated with a changing climate. These range from a thawing ground to loss of sea ice to flooding and freezing rain. Permafrost is thawing in Alaska. The data support that. This graphic shows measurements of ground temperature. These are temperatures at about a depth of 10 to 20 meters, well below the surface, at that network of stations that's mapped with green squares on the left. Northern Alaska, the temperature time series are shown in the upper right panel. And you can see how the permafrost up on the north slope has warmed by 2 or 3 degrees C since about 1980. If you extrapolate that, you end up with temperatures near freezing by the end of the century. That's referring to permafrost that's on the north slope, which we normally think of as solidly entrenched in ice. So even the permafrost there is at risk. The lower right panel shows interior temperatures, temperatures in the permafrost, 10 to 20 meter depth at various sites. The temperatures here are much closer to freezing already. The increase is not quite as rapid, but it's still upward in all cases. So the message here is that we have evidence that permafrost is, temperatures are rising towards freezing. The impacts are apparent in many areas, not just in the buildings, but even in the roads and the forest. That so-called drunken forest appearance in the slide on the right is one of the signs of thawing permafrost in an area that has not been disturbed by roads or buildings. Here is what I find to be a somewhat sobering figure. It's a map showing where permafrost, where ground temperatures are above freezing in a recent decade at the top and mid-century in the bottom. The red areas on those maps are the areas that are above freezing. You can see how in the early 2000s, most of Alaska was in the blue. The interior has a lot of discontinuous permafrost, but it's dominated by blue. When we move to that bottom panel, the 2050s, the red starts to dominate, especially in southwestern Alaska, much of interior Alaska, and even the southern Seward Peninsula. These predictions are based on a permafrost model that the Permafrost Lab in our Geophysical Institute has run, but it captures the historical variations pretty well. And if it's right, it's saying that the ground will be thawing over much of central and southwestern Alaska in just about 3 decades, the 2050s. So this risk to the landscape is real and becoming imminent. Here's just a quick look at the sea ice. We know we've lost sea ice. The pair of maps here show the sea ice distribution at mid-November. And the message that, the salient message for impacts is that Western Alaska is now ice-free. The West Coast is ice-free much longer into the autumn, in fact, into November and December, whereas it used to be buffered by sea ice back in the 1980s and 1990s. The implication is that coastal storms will be able to generate waves that can impact the coast with erosion and flooding. We have a few snapshots here of floods in Nome, Kotzebue, and Teller, three very important Western communities. These are events that will become increasingly common as storms have an open ocean to work with in the months of October, November, and even December. Freezing rain is one other hazard that's associated with a changing climate. The impacts here apply not only to wildlife, which are unable to access their forage below the ice layer, but also to travel over roads. That photo on the right shows a road in Fairbanks after a freezing rain event. And when we get these freezing rain events in winter, the ice can persist for weeks or even months on the road. So there are definitely hazards as far as transportation goes. This is an example of a reindeer herd in Siberia. There was a freezing rain event about 8 years ago that led to 60,000 reindeer deaths in this same region. So the impacts for at least the health and the survivability of large numbers of wildlife can be significant. And the reason I mention this hazard is that the freezing rain events, or rain on snow events, as they're sometimes referred to, are predicted to increase over much of Alaska. This is a climate model prediction of how the freezing rain events are supposed to change in frequency. Orange and red mean increases. So the freezing rain will become more frequent. The blue indicates less frequent freezing rain event. So with a warming climate, what we expect to see is less freezing rain in the southwestern part of the state, where air temperatures will be above freezing more often. But in the rest of the state, in the eastern part of Russia, Chukotka, these freezing rain events are expected to increase. The ground will remain snow-covered and cold, while the air is warm enough to melt the falling snow and produce rain. So this hazard is one that we expect to increase as time goes on. So here's a summary. We've stepped through the various health-related impacts, the warmer air and water temperatures, the longer, drier summers, and the increases in hazards. All of these have potential health impacts. There are some positive impacts, longer growing seasons and fewer days with extreme cold. But what I wanted to finish with on this last slide is a link back to the health nexus, what we call the climate health nexus. And what are some needs? One of the real needs, as far as the research on this topic goes, is for some metrics of health-related impacts. These could be biomedical information. They could be other types of information that actually document the impacts of particular events or gradual changes on human health. That would let us get into the quantifying the risk assessments that are associated with climate change, and those risk assessments that could then inform planning and adaptation actions and ultimately some solutions. So I think there's potential here for linking the work that's being done in the health community and the climate community. And I welcome any comments or questions along those lines. So with that, I'll stop. I think we have about 5 more minutes for questions. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. That was very informative. Let's see if we have any questions. I don't see any on my screen. I have one question while we're looking for anyone else to reach out and ask questions. the link between the subsistence lifestyle and climate impacts, you briefly touched on that, but it's, I think, much larger than we seem to acknowledge. And I'd like to hear a little more of your thoughts on that.
I agree completely. And in fact, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program has come to that same conclusion, that we barely scratched the surface when it comes to recognizing and documenting the impacts on communities, not just in Alaska, but throughout the Arctic. The Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program is planning an assessment along those lines for the next 2 years. So I think the recognition is there, but the impacts do extend beyond the relation to subsistence and fuel gathering. I mean, there are social impacts, economic impacts, just human impacts that go with climate change, and I think they've been poorly documented and not recognized. So I think there's a lot to be done in that area, and I would call that one of the priority topics for attention as far as this climate health intersection goes.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that is something we could all work together on. All right, I don't see any other questions. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we let you go?
No, I would say thanks again for listening. And if anyone does have suggestions for follow-ups, ways we could link the climate and health, the work that's being done in the climate and health communities, we're certainly interested in that here at the university. And I think there's a lot we can do together.
Yeah, I think we have one question from Kyle Warka. Do you cover paralytic shellfish poisoning, or is that related to the algal blooms?
Well,
that increase? That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is perhaps one of the more tractable impacts of the warming climate, because there are toxins that require a certain water temperature to survive. And my understanding is that the toxins that lead to the shellfish poisoning are in that category. They require a certain water temperature to survive. So to the extent that the temperatures are warming and will continue to warm, I think the risk of the shellfish poisoning is likely to increase over time. It's likely to become more widespread. So that is one that I think is one of the direct impacts of the warming water.
Okay, we have one more question from Lucinda Crow. Based on the climate change predictions, can you also predict a change in migratory patterns?
Mm-hmm. You know, that's an interesting one. And it's been raised before. We do not have any silver bullet answers on that one. I think the migratory patterns of birds may be key to the astronomical cycle, the solar angle and that type of thing, as much as to changing temperatures. So I think that's one of the more challenging aspects of change, to document the link between the timing of migrations and weather and climate patterns. So I think there's the potential for some great projects there, but the caveat is it's not an easy nut to crack, as they say. It's a challenging problem.
Yes, I agree. You know, there's a lot of snow geese up north, and they're thinking that it's because of the melting permafrost. So that is an interesting question. One more question, our final question: how can local environmental observers, the LEO network, best be used to assess these impacts? And this is from Dr. Tim Thomas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that LEO network is really a flagship activity in terms of letting the world know what's happening on the ground in relation to climate and weather events. So I think the key there is to widen the net and train as much information as possible, and see what patterns are emerging in terms of the impacts that are documented. I think the people out on the ground are in the best position to document what has happened and to relate the impacts of what has happened. But then as the database builds up, I think we will start to see some patterns. And that's when I think the world cannot help but notice that there really are signals of climate change that matter in places like Alaska.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, and appreciate all this information. I'll hand it back over to Kalani.